Good to have you back for this interview on Africa 24. We are here in Marrakesh, Morocco, on the occasion of the 14th U.S.-Africa Business Summit. Today we'll be receiving on set Mrs. Akunna Cook. She's the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary General of State for African Affairs. She will be sharing with us her vision for the strengthening of partnerships at a time when the world is fighting the negative effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and now the war in Ukraine. Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mildred. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So you are taking part in the 14th U.S.-Africa Business Summit. What is your view about the whole idea of this summit at a time when the world is fighting against the pandemic and the war in Ukraine?
This is the exact perfect time to be convening members of the private sector across Africa, U.S. private sector, U.S. government officials, as well as African government officials to talk about how we promote trade and investment in Africa during these difficult times. We know that across the world, families are sitting at the kitchen tables dealing with the rising cost of food, dealing with the rising cost of fuel as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so it is critically important that we look at some of these challenges and how we are going to confront them, and also contemplate some of the opportunities that may come out of this crisis, such as the urgent need to finally make manufacturing on the continent a reality, the urgent need to effectuate regional integration through the AFCFTA, and for us in the U.S. government to look at the tools that we have that promote trade and investment and see how we modernize and make these tools much more effective so that we can ensure that not only Africa, but the U.S. as well gets through this crisis.
So can you tell us more about the role of your department or the contribution of your department in boosting partnerships between, especially trade and investment ties between Africa and the U.S.?
So the State Department, which is the equivalent of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is the lead agency responsible for leading our foreign policy. And what we know is that we are living in the African century. 3 out of 4 new human beings born in this century will be African. And so we recognize that we are indeed at an inflection point. And so if we know that we want a more prosperous, peaceful world, it has to begin with partnerships with our African allies. And so we are committed to ensuring that when we engage with partner governments about the range of issues that we share, whether that be COVID-19 and being prepared for pandemics, whether that be the crisis of democracy and governance around the world, or peace and security, that we are elevating the need to partner with African countries and to find solutions that prepare us to confront a more prosperous and peaceful Africa.
So after this summit, what are some of the key sectors in Africa we should expect to see increased investments from the U.S.?
Several weeks ago, President Biden announced the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, and part of this PGII initiative is a focus on digital, climate, health, and gender. And so I think that you will continue to see a focus by the United States on these particular sectors. We know that Africa is going through a digital transformation, and that it will be key to ensuring that Africa's young people are part of contributing their solutions to the challenges facing the world. And so we know that we have to focus and invest in digital infrastructure and also digital literacy and capacity building. Similarly, climate change is an existential crisis that is facing the entire world. Although Africans don't emit much CO2, they are bearing much of the brunt of severe weather changes. And so we want to make sure that we're making investments in the green economy, and making sure that Africans are prepared and have the adequate financing to implement some of these new technologies. And of course, we are still living through a pandemic, and we know that we need to strengthen health systems around the world, and particularly in Africa. And so I think you'll continue to see investments in these sectors. And of course, we have to make sure that half of the population, the women of the world, are able to participate equally in the economy. So I think you'll definitely see a continued interest and investment in these sectors.
So during this summit, private-public partnership has been recommended to boost recovery. We know with the COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, the private sector is the most affected, so they have challenges to overcome. How can they leverage this summit to overcome such challenges?
This summit is an excellent opportunity for members of the private sector to meet each other, for companies that are looking for financing to meet with banks, for companies that are looking for partnerships to meet with other companies, and of course to talk to governments. One of the themes that has resonated throughout the conference is the role that the private sector will play as regional integration through the AFCFTA is implemented to make sure that countries are taking full advantage of the promise of regional integration and the promise of reevaluating our supply chains as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, to ensure that Africa can fully emerge from this crisis ready to really take its seat, because we know that Africa is the future, and we know that Africans are going to have to be a part of a strong global economy. And so I think there's enormous opportunity here for governments. It is why the United States delegation is includes 60 members of our delegation, because we have several agencies here that are represented looking to partner with the U.S. and African private sector to build a stronger Africa.
So at a time when African governments are leveraging the power of the African Continental Free Trade Area to boost their markets, is the U.S. presence, don't you think the U.S. presence is a setback for this ambition?
I think the U.S. presence is actually a key part to the goals of regional integration. Our companies are eager to see African countries not only ratify but begin to implement the AFCFTA, because we now go from having 54 separate markets to having one large African market. And that makes it much easier not only for Africans to trade with each other, but for other countries to trade with Africa. And that will increase incomes and standards of living for all Africans as well as Americans and others. And so the U.S. presence is exactly what not only the AFCFTA and African countries want, but I think will actually make regional integration stronger, and we will all benefit from that.
So how can Africa leverage the opportunities presented by such platforms, by the U.S. Africa Business Summit, in order to guarantee win-win economic partnerships for both parties?
I think it really is just about taking advantage of the opportunity that convenings like this provide to further deals, to identify areas of priorities and shared priorities with the U.S., with other African countries, and to raise concerns. I mean, we know that Africa is facing several challenges, and we know that there are countries that have to do some work to improve their enabling environment. These are real challenges that African countries are facing, whether it be around good governance and ensuring that contracts are honored, ensuring that the regulatory infrastructure is where it needs to be. This is exactly where we need to be having these kinds of frank conversations, sharing information about opportunities, and making sure that we're leveraging these connections as we move forward. Vice President Harris announced that the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit will be taking place in December from the 13th to the 15th. And so that is an additional opportunity for African governments to engage the United States and the private sector to continue what our shared goal of economic prosperity on the continent.
All right, thank you, ma'am, for honoring our invite.
Thank you.
And that was it for this interview on the occasion of the 14th U.S. Africa Business Summit. We have more programs coming up on Africa 24.